Hello and welcome to Happy Hour, the first one in my shiny new place. This is Eileen Cook, and today is May 1st, if you can believe it. I personally can't, but it is. So I have a few things to talk about today, but I also wanted to check and see if anyone had any particular questions they wanted tackled. It's a no. It's looking like a no. So you'll never guess the topic that I thought about, which is writing when your life is in chaos. Not that I know anything about that, but hypothetically, if you were going through a move or you have some personal life crisis going on, like how do you sort of keep up and deal with it? And so I'm kind of going to first break it into two things. So the first thing you have to decide is your life in chaos in a short term, or is your life going to be in chaos for a long term? If it's going to be a short term thing, if you have someone in town, or you have a move, or you have something going on, one of the decisions you might make is that you're actually just not going to write. That you're just going to focus on other priorities and kind of get through that. The only secret that I would say to you is if you are going to do that, make sure you're giving yourself a hard deadline of when you're going to come back. Because sometimes we think, oh, I'm just in short-term chaos, but actually what your life is a series of short-term chaos periods that are just going to kind of go from one to another to another. So you need to have sort of a hard deadline in terms of, okay, I need to take, like I actually gave myself permission last week that I was going to do nothing. That, if something got done, that was a bonus, but I was not in any way, shape, or form expecting myself to get anything done. And I gave myself the hard deadline of yesterday because I actually had my old university roommate came into town to help me with the move, and her flight back was yesterday. So that was my sort of timeline that while she was in town, that was my time to focus, get things unpacked as possible. But starting back yesterday, I needed to get back to my routine. So if you are going to take a break, make sure you put some sort of parameters around that. If your life is in chaos, but it seems like maybe it's either going to be a series of chaos and or that just is your new life. For example, you've had a baby or something else is going on or just that's life. Then you need to figure out how you're going to write despite that. So I'm going to go through a couple tips, and then I'm going to be curious if there's anything else that you guys take advantage of that you use, and then you can kind of go with that. So the first thing that I'm going to suggest is that you write by kind of carving out some time. So taking a look at your calendar, and that may mean that you have to get up a little bit earlier, or you have to stay up a little bit later, but that you're trying to sort of eke out some amount of time where you're saying, this time I will honor for writing. As short as 15 minutes. And sometimes it feels like that is all that we actually can carve out. But there's something about making a date with yourself, if that makes sense, that if you have it and you keep up with it, you'll find that the story stays fresh in your mind. Stephen King talks about this in his book on writing. Show of hands, how many people have loved and read that book? Maybe you've read it and you didn't love it. That's okay too. If you haven't read it, I would give it a big thumbs up. Even if you're not a Stephen King fan, like if you think I don't like his scary stuff or whatever, I would really encourage it. I think it's one of the better books about writing and the writing process. And he talks about the fact that he writes every day. Like Christmas, birthdays, everything. I can't do that personally. Like I actually need some time away from my manuscript here and there. And I used to do it actually on the weekends, on Sunday. Unless I was really in the groove and I just couldn't stay away, which is never a bad thing. But I gave myself permission to not write on that day. But if you take big breaks away from your writing, what you'll find is you lose track of the story. So I don't know if anyone has had the experience where you are writing, but because you've been away, you actually need to sort of stop and almost reread what you've been writing because you've kind of forgot where you were or what was happening in the story. And the problem is that, of course, that every time you have to restart that process, it's just taking you away from productive time. So even if you tell yourself, I'm only going to carve out 10 or 15 minutes Monday to Friday, what I'm going to argue, you definitely can find that time. Like that time does exist in your schedule, is just 10 minutes that you're in the story and you're not forgetting. So if you get 2 or 3 sentences in it, or 3 pages, you're actually still making progress. So that's really useful and worthwhile. And I can't remember what book I stole it from, but someone talked about if you write a page a day, which is 250 words, which is really not bad at all. If you do that in a year, you'd have a book. So, and let's be honest, you're probably going to get more than a page done on at least some of those days. But doing that, like carving out even that small amount of time, can help. My next tip for dealing with writing during chaos is to change up your process. So I think we all tend to get in habits. So we have a particular writing space, or we have, I know some writers who have what I think of as the voodoo going. So they have, a certain scented candle that they like to burn when they're writing, or they have music that they like to have playing when they're writing, or they need, just the right, they need to be, on a cruise ship to get any writing done. So they're constantly having to go on cruises. For example, Bonnie, talking to you. If you change that up, if you say to yourself, okay, my life is in chaos, so today I'm going to write in a coffee shop or at a library, or I'm going to write on paper and pen, that sometimes frees yourself up, that you give yourself permission to do it differently. I like having a routine, and I am the first person to admit that I am very routine focused. I do better with that. Having said that, when my routine is in chaos, sometimes then all the writing goes out the window. Saying it doesn't have to be my usual writing routine. It's okay if I sit down and I write in a journal for 30 minutes. It's okay if I sit on the sofa and just type out a little bit. Just giving yourself that permission to do it differently can help. The next one that I am thinking a lot about, not just with writing, but in general, is the concept of, someone said, it's actually in the book, You Are a Badass. I don't know if anyone else has read that, by Jen Sincero. She talks about, what if you just gave, and she uses 75%, or the concept of good enough. I think we always say, I give 110%. And that's great if you have the energy and the bandwidth to give 110%. But sometimes maybe 75%, 80% would be good enough. And I think we often don't do that. So to say to yourself, this doesn't have to be a perfect scene. This doesn't have to be that I do a chapter a day. My house doesn't have to be perfectly clean. Everything doesn't have to be perfect. I could do good enough. And I think we don't do that often enough. So thinking to yourself, you know what? I'm just going to be okay with the fact that I got anything done. So, if you have a routine that you do at the gym, maybe you just settle for you walked around the block. Or maybe you kayaked down an incredible river that looked insane, that I actually question some people's sanity about doing that with cold water. But hey, I'm more of a cruise ship kind of gal than a kayak down a wild river gal. But you know what I mean? That you just give yourself permission, as long as you are, in fact, doing what needs to get done. Now, does anyone else have any tip that they do when they just need to be writing, even when things are in chaos? So I'm going to give a call out, because Bonnie, even though I tease her for being on a cruise ship, is on vacation and she's here. So I know that she and I talked about, I was saying to her, I was giving her permission to not have to turn in pages right away. And she was like, oh, but I still come up with really good ideas. And I think that's a little bit of that idea of, sometimes when you change locations, you change up what you're thinking about, and it sort of seems and feels a little bit different. So sometimes that chaos can, it can fill your writer's soul if it's really lovely and relaxing, or it might give you some insight. So I think that's useful. Anyone else have a tip that they particularly find useful when they're trying to write with chaos going on around them? Oh, nice. So Tracy mentioned in the chat, using a voice recorder is a really good idea. And I'm going to fit that into another way of kind of changing up your routine. So I am definitely not, I know some people who use dictation to do all of their books, which I find oddly fascinating. And I do want to try it one of these days. So people who are using something like Dragon to sort of talk and get those words in. But even if you're not using Dragon, walking around with your phone. So sort of saying to yourself, I'm going to try and double up. So if I'm doing one thing, maybe I can still get, some words in, and I'll transcribe it at a later time. The Dragon app for your phone, you actually can speak into it and it will do the transcribing for you. Aha.
When I'm stuck, I have a little recorder and I go for a walk along the river with my dog and I pretend I'm talking to her, but I talk. Like I really like dialogue, and I find that I can talk the dialogue like I'm actually doing a scene, and I can get through stuff and I find out stuff about my character. And if people walk by, I just I'm talking to my dog, and then I just turn it off and I come home and I listen to it. And I don't use all of it, but I really find that that makes me so immersed in the scene that I can see what people would say, and I do the voices. And I mean, if people could see me, yep. Or they probably do.
I was going to say, you're the crazy lady down by the river, right? Like that woman talks to her dog in different voices and has complete conversations with people who aren't there, which is fine. There's no shame in that. And I think that's really useful. Like one of the things we talk about as writers, sometimes reading your work out loud is really helpful. But I think it is also just the process of voicing. That's a squeaky toy that you hear in the background, in case you're wondering what that is. Cairo, put down the bunny, sweetheart. Thank you. All right. That's going to last for about 2 seconds. Okay, we're just going to enjoy that. But the process of speaking aloud is really useful. And talking through what you're working on is really useful, either with yourself or your dog, or with another writer. Like I think sometimes if you find that you're in chaos or that you're stuck, getting together with a writer friend and talking through what you're working on is really useful, particularly if you have deadlines where you're going to talk about something and then meet. So Christy and I met in the SFU program. And one of the things that I think was so helpful about that program is that you are you're talking to people about their stories and about what they're doing. And that can be really a useful process. And one, because it forces you to go back and think about your own writing. But two, it lets you raise questions and you talk through. And, I think what you find, or at least I even find with these office hours, is as I'm talking about stuff, I get excited about it, or I suddenly have an idea and I think, oh, I want to try that in my own piece. And again, I think the thing I'm going to keep cycling back to, just as my dog is going to keep cycling back to that stupid stuff funny, is that when you're in your story, when you're thinking about your story, as Bonnie put in the chat window, not discounting daydreaming, whether you're taking naps or various things, is you're thinking it through and the process is coming along and stuff opens up and ideas come to you. So to think about that is really, really useful. So I want to transition from kind of talking about how we deal with chaos and change to then thinking about how your character deals with it. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, oh my, for the love of God, give me that thing. Give it. Don't you run away from me. He's now looking at me with the saddest eyes that you have ever seen on the planet. Like, I was playing with that. But now there is no more squeaky toy, so all is good. So until he finds another one, but that's all right. I think as I've been going through this move and through this kind of personal change in my own life, one of the odd things that I've been doing that I was encouraged to do, even by my agent, is, she said, at some point we're going to monetize your pain, which is a very hardcore thing of an agent to say, but it's also very true. So I've been kind of journaling and thinking about how I feel and how that emotion is showing up in my, what kind of process I'm going for, because at some point I am going to use it with a character. And for example, one of the things that I noticed for myself is I am currently covered in bruises, which is one part moving boxes here and there. But I also think because I'm tending to be rushing around a lot, and I'm tending to, I'll kind of walk into a room, stop, turn, guess who found another toy? Just, I'll move from kind of one space to another. I'm bumping into things. I'm more clumsy. I've dropped more stuff in the past week than I have probably in a year. So I'm realizing that I think when you're in change emotionally, as well as a physical space, you're not as coordinated. So I actually made a note of that, consciously thinking about oh, that's a detail that I could add to a character. That's something that they might find. My ability to be forgetful has also gone way up. And I can kind of connect that. I know that I'm not sleeping the same. I'm not doing certain stuff the same. So I'm sort of thinking about how those things play out in my own space as I'm going through the change, and then thinking about how could I potentially use that for characters. Because all of our characters are going through change. That's what we're doing for them. We're putting them into chaotic situations. So having a chance to kind of reflect on how you're dealing with it, even if you're not dealing with, aliens or, Aztec warlords or anything else, you are still kind of going through that. And I know as a counselor that people work through those process. So, one of the things that we know about real people that is useful for our characters is that change is almost never a one-step process. You have to be with certain things like that, is that your home is blown up, and so you have to but even once you move, it's still a process to get there with the acceptance of that thing. So people don't just say, I'm now going to seek out love and I'm ready to do it. Or there's not a moment where someone says, I'm over that death. I grieved, and then today I was officially over that. Or I have officially fallen in love at that moment. Those things don't happen in a moment. They're kind of back and forth, back and forth. So thinking about how you're going to show that for your character, how are they going to kind of take one step forward, two steps back? Because I think there's a tendency in writing to sort of show it as a linear progression, oh, I want to show at the beginning that they're afraid of everything. And then each step along the way, they're getting braver and braver and braver until the final scene where they have to do this super brave thing. And Alyssa, warrior of the future, right? Complete with burning kayaks and sundry things and armor. And that's not the way it works. People will take a step, they will be more brave, but then something will happen, it'll knock them down, and they'll think that was stupid, I shouldn't have been that brave. What was I thinking getting into a kayak in Alberta in April? They'll kind of slide back, and then they'll do something else that's brave, right? So making sure that you're showing that as sort of a transitional thing. Depending what the changes that your character is going through, the first step that they often will have is that they need to change at all. They will keep trying to do the things that they used to do. And they may not even accept, they'll be like, everything is fine. My only problem is everybody else wants me to make a change. So you'll sometimes see that with health issues. So it's my grandmother smoked and she lived to 110. There's no reason for me to think about smoking. The only problem I have is that my doctor and my spouse are on my, hassling me to quit smoking. So that can be kind of a state of that change. They'll often talk about the past, even if they know they can't go back to that past. So you'll see that. I have a friend who's going through the grief process. Her husband passed away in December. And she'll often say, like, I know he's gone, but, but, and then she'll insert what she, like, but I want this thing to make dinner in the evening. I want this kind of thing, like, exactly. So she will kind of cycle back to that repeatedly. I know that he's gone. I know that he's not coming back. I know I can't change this, but, and then she'll sort of insert that feeling. And what I've noticed, and again, she's still in the very early stages, right? Like we're not that far off since the loss of her husband, but she's starting to now start talking about future self. I want to. So I can sort of see this change happening where she's starting to reach out for this new future. You know, now that Victor's gone, he hated to travel, so she's actually going to do more travel. So I'm planning a trip to here. I'm going to do this thing. She's actually, which I think is wonderful. I asked her at one point if she had any regrets in her life. And she said one of the strangest things is she really wished she had been a growing up. She had loved going to camp, but she had never been a camp counselor. So what she's doing this summer is she's going to be a camp counselor. She's going to be the oldest camp counselor in the state of Oregon at 50, but she's going to be a camp counselor because it's something that she wished she had done as growing up. And now she can do it because, you know, obviously her husband's not at home. And so she thinks it will do her some good to just not be at home either. So she is leaving for the summer and going to be a camp counselor. When I was actually working as a counselor, not at camp, when people had to kind of make a big change, and again, I was working primarily with people who had disabilities. So they were having to make a shift to understanding what their life was going to be like when they were in this new state of health, whatever that looked like. Talked a lot about was having faith to let go of what was. So the analogy that I used a lot was it's like a trapeze. So you're swinging on a trapeze and you like that trapeze. That trapeze is keeping you from plummeting to the floor, which is very far below, and maybe there are tigers down there. So the temptation is to want to hang on to that trapeze. But of course, the problem is the trapeze is slowing, right? Like you can't stay on it. Like at some point, you have to let go, turn around, and have faith that there will be another trapeze or another trapeze artist swinging towards you that you can grab a hold of. And that takes a huge literal leap of faith. You can imagine being suspended up above these tigers and that you have to just be like, okay, I'm going to let go. And that's what we're asking our to do, is to let go of what's been a perfectly functioning trapeze and to sort of make that move. So how do you know someone's getting ready to do that? Well, one is when people start imagining what their life will look like in the future. So they'll start saying, you know, when I travel, I would like to, or and again, as a counselor, we're asking them, like you'll often say to, like if you've been to counseling, you probably have heard this where someone will say, well, tell me what it would look like when this thing has already happened. And we're basically asking them to start imagining it. So if you've been ever in couples counseling, you're initially often talking about like, I hate when he does this, or this is a huge problem, but that's old trapeze. So a marriage counselor will often say to you, like, what would it look like if you guys were to have more communication? This or that. Like we would take walks in the evening after we put the kids to bed and talk about our own lives. And then, of course, you're asking people to start engaging in those activities. So what is your character doing? Like, what is it that appeals to them about the life that they had? And we call that in counseling the pros of not changing and the cons of changing. And that is the first often step. So for example, if we're talking about something like a smoker will talk about like, well, if I quit smoking, I'm going to put on weight. You know, if I quit smoking, I'm never going to take a break at work because it's only when I take a smoke break that I get. Right? So you can see that they're listing for themselves all the reasons why they should not quit smoking. And all the cons, like I'm going to gain weight, I'm going to do all this, like smoking relaxes me. Like they're thinking of the pros of their old behavior and the cons of the new behavior. And what we're wanting them to do is to switch that around. So we'll start saying to them, like, what would be the good things about quitting smoking? Oh, well, I'd be able to run more. I'd be able to be more active. What are the cons of staying smoking? Well, my health is getting worse, or I smell like cigarette smoke all the time, and I want to start changing that. So you'll see, again, because it's not a one-step process, that the person will slowly start looking at the advantages of that. That's even in terms of emotional change. So hypothetically, if you were going through a divorce, and I'm just spitballing here, start by talking about what you loved about that relationship and the cons of getting divorced. I'm going to die alone and my dogs are going to feast on my body. This is the downside. This is the other downside. This is all the bad things that are going on. And what, certainly is going to happen in any kind of counseling situation is you'll start seeing people start to say, I'm going to decorate my space any way that I want. I can watch on Netflix, I can binge all of Game of Thrones if I want to, and there's no one to say, shouldn't you take a shower? I'm going to have exactly what I want for dinner. And they may feel, particularly for a character who's kind of going through that emotional change, initially, they're not going to be convinced of that. Or they're going to take the one step forward and back. So they're going to be like, damn right, I'm going to binge watch Game of Thrones, and I'm going to sit here on the sofa and eat popcorn and not take a shower. And all of a sudden they're going to be like, I haven't been off the couch and I haven't showered and all I've done is watch Game of Thrones. My life is horrible. And they'll swing back to the other trapeze for a moment, where they're just not ready to let go of that, particularly if they liked that thing. I happen to know a counselor who was talking to someone, hypothetically me, about making change and going through that emotional change. And he was saying, you're on an island and you liked that island. And now you have to get off of it. And you're on a boat and the boat feels tippy and it doesn't feel stable at all. And you're sailing to a new island. But you don't know if you're going to like that island yet. So there's a real fear of kind of letting go of land, of what you've had, to kind of go to an uncharted territory and be like, that's going to be a new good place. But in many cases, what we're doing is not letting our characters have a choice. We are setting fire to their island. A volcano has gone off. They have to make that switch, and we see that happening. I think that's why in a lot of books, there is an actual physical change of space that happens, right? So the character goes on a road trip because we can show them being uncomfortable. We can show Frodo going from the Shire out into the rest of, the Middle Earth to see what is going to happen, because we conceptually always get that idea of a journey as being an emotional thing and as a physical thing. Most people find like that's why travel often is important, is when we go away from what we know, we look at everything in a different way. So if your character is staying in the same place, if they can't hypothetically get on a cruise ship, what is on that thing? How is that changing? If I was writing a book about my current experiences, I would really want to play up on the pages like the things happening around the move, around things getting packed up, around the old place looking empty. I would want to describe that because part of that is the setting reflecting the emotional space, and then the character / me moving into a new space and putting things on the wall and decorating in that space. And what is that looking like? So the stage where there's boxes everywhere, where there's chaos, where you feel unsettled. Again, if this was a story, as you saw the character putting things away, you would automatically assume there's some amount of emotional healing going on. Now, because it's a book and not real life, I would probably go for that overly dramatic, cheesy moment where a vase that they got on their honey gets broken in the move. So there's a moment of crying when that vase breaks and the character's devastated because the vase represents that kind of thing. So I would probably want to go for some kind of symbol or something that might happen in that kind of thing. But thinking about how the physical space changes, how the character moves through that. And my kind of last thought on that is change is hard. So make sure you're not going too easy on your characters. Apparently the universe has thought that for me as well. So I have been apparently the universe is a writer who is thinking, I can make this more definitely in fiction. You want to think about that. And, you know, I was meeting with SFU students last night, and one of the things that came up in one student's work is she was great at throwing things at her character, but the character's first solution worked every time. Right? So, you know, the character's, you know, going down this dark hallway when all of a sudden someone jumps out at her, but she pulls a knife and stabs them and is able to get away. And then this thing happens, and then she does this thing and it works. And this next thing happens. And then she does this next thing and she's successful. So we had a lot of talk about, she was doing part of that really, really well because she kept upping the ante and making things challenging for her character. But there wasn't a sense that this character would ever know how to deal with failure, because part of any challenge is the fact that you slide back. So Alyssa, speak about your kayak experience, because one of the things that I thought about is that is often sometimes a one step forward, two steps back, and that you were, you know, terrified at times, but you kind of have to keep going. So I wonder if you could talk about that, and we can think about that in terms of characters.
Okay, so the day before so it was New Rivers, and I always find New Rivers very anxious, I have a lot of anxiety for the whole trip, even in the easy parts on New Rivers, because I don't know what's around the corner. So the day before we had got out and we had looked at something, and my coach had been like, okay, so what do you see here? And I told him the line that you would kayak down. And he's like, yeah, that's exactly it. There's nothing complicated. Like, you've seen the line, you can do this. And the longer we stood there, the longer we heard the crashing and banging of the river, and then knowing that the next section was called the canyon. And canyon means you can't get out and walk around. Canyon means you're stuck in there. And like, I actually started crying. And so I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to call it here. I'm going to call it a day here. And I didn't paddle the next section of river. And then the next day, there was no option to look at the feature. He just basically had to explain the line to me and say, okay, you're going to follow, and this is how we're going to do it, and you'll be fine, and just keep paddling. And we did it. And it was a harder section of river, but because I hadn't seen it, I hadn't had time to be afraid of it. I just had to keep paddling and go for it.
So what really strikes me when you say that is, first, that you're insane, and also my hero at the exact same time. I think that's awesome. But I also think that's an interesting thing to think about is, does your character know what's coming up next? Have they seen around the corner? And you can see from a writing perspective, that offers you two very different options, right? So if the character knows what's coming, they can build up the fear, and also then the reader is going to be scared. And that's really when we talk about sort of that sense of suspense, that this thing is coming. We kind of know something is coming, and we have time to be scared of it before it arrives. That's what they're doing in a horror movie when they're playing the scary music for you. Like, the character may not know, but you as the watcher know something bad is about to happen. But if the character knows that, it adds added suspense. Then there's surprise, right? Where, you know, maybe the character is like me and is like, oh, it's a nice little paddle that I'm going to go on. Won't this be lovely? And then, you know, we go around the corner and holy shit, it's not lovely. It's something called the canyons. And there's, you know, I don't know which way I'm going to go or to go down this thing. And you can imagine then again, as a reader, that's going to be a very different reading experience because it's going to be that, oh my God, what are they going to do? And like the person in this situation, they're going to have no choice. If you're wanting to set up that the character has no option, you want to go with something that has surprised them and they have to react in that moment. You either, I'm guessing, drowned, or you get through that part of the river. Like, I'm not sure there are a lot of other plans B. Like, if you can't get out of your car, like if you can't be like, okay, I quit. If you can't go down the hill, speaking of a ski analogy, on your butt, what are you going to do? And then how is the character going to react to that? So that, I think, becomes a very interesting thing. So Christy, you mentioned Dan Brown. What are you talking about there?
I'm just thinking of your writer from last night at SFU with, oh, here's the solution. Ta-da. That's what drives me nuts with Dan Brown. It's like, this mystery hasn't been solved for 8,000 years. Oh, but look, in 4 hours. Oh, look, I go around the corner and yes, it must be this way. Oh, I'm right. And I just rewatched Angels and Demons. That was like my, you know, dirty thing to do for myself and not shower. I hate it, but I love it at the same time.
I don't believe in the term guilty pleasure. I think it's just pleasure and we should just have it without the guilt. But yeah, like, I think you're right. There are a lot of thrillers that I see, which sometimes it can just be fun because it's like, oh, then, because I think what it is it's almost all surprise things. Then this happens and then I solve it and I get down the river and then I come around the corner and there's, you know, Aboriginals throwing, but I make it through and I'm fine. And then this thing happens. And I think it does, however, get tiring and it's not as emotionally satisfying as when we see that kind of back and forth. And when you have, you know, as Christy put it, like, you know, this mystery hasn't been solved for thousands of years, then the character really can't be like, oh, wait, what's this hieroglyphic here mean? Like we have to have some reason to believe at this moment in time, something different has happened, has transpired. And I think in particular, if it's not total chance, it's not just that I happen to be in the cave on the day of the summer solstice. So I realize that the sun comes through this tiny little hole at this moment, which illuminates something, which makes it look different. Like, you can do that, but I think it's more, will have more bang for the buck for the reader if there is some piece of knowledge that the character has gained through something else that gives them the ability to capture that moment. So there's something that they learned earlier that makes them know that the summer solstice is going to open up something that no one else has thought of that before. And so I probably wouldn't make it the solstice because I have to think in some time in 1,000 years, someone would have thought, hey, I wonder if the one day that the day is longer or shorter might somehow be important to this giant sun worshiping community that we're from and might illuminate things in a different way. So that would help with that. Other thoughts or questions about getting your character through chaos and change? I am going to, go ahead, Christy.
Oh, I just had another question, thought for ourselves. And I've run into this myself because I do handle things pretty well in life. And it's not that it doesn't have this happening, and I have had things like this happen. But for me, being a pretty logical person, who's like, oh yeah, okay, so if I do this, and then I do this, and I do this, then I'm probably going to get some kind of satisfactory thing, but I'm open to change. So I'm like this really logical person. But it's terrible to be that when you're a writer because you don't want your characters to be logical. And it's this constant battle with myself. It's like, okay, Sam, what are you going to do? If he were me, he'd be like, oh, well, I just do this, and then my life will be good. It's like, no, you have to be crazy. So I think sometimes it's just allowing ourselves to even do kind of divergent thinking exercises of, okay, so what if this happened? And then what? Okay, so then what if that happened? And what if that happened? And I practice it cruelly on my art students. That we do these, we do kind of prompt exercises as well in my classes, more for visual stuff. But I get them to do this sort of what I call divergent prompts. And I said, it's really good just for your brain to do this. So I said, if I give you the word porridge, you could draw a bowl of porridge. But what if you thought about it and did a little bit of brainstorming? And I'm saying this to them, but I'm really saying it to myself, to this super logical self. So I thought, okay, if I think of porridge, what am I going to draw? So if I think of porridge, I think of oatmeal. I don't like oatmeal. And I think of oats. I think of the Quaker Oats box. I think of the guy on the Quaker Oats box who was a Quaker. My parents were Quakers. So every Sunday as a kid, we had to have all the Quakers in Vernon come to our house, which was 2 people. And Mr. Martin was one of them. And he was this old guy who couldn't speak. And we were like totally freaked out by this guy. And then one Easter, I made him Easter eggs and it made him cry. So from porridge to tears. And I thought, okay, I can do this. So it's those kind of things that I sort of have to force myself to do. And I just wondered if anyone else is like just pathologically logical.
No, I am not. So you can channel me and my inner anxiety when you're trying to figure out what your characters would do. So that's an option for you. But I do think, so a couple of things came to my mind with that. So is that reminder, it's not what I would do, it's what the character would do. The second thing is, if you do have a character that's really logical, what I find interesting is that sometimes for that person, they will fall apart at a different time. So for example, I can be quite logical in the moment, and I tend to handle emergencies quite well. Like, if someone, and I'm sure I've told the story before, when my old day job, someone dropped of a heart attack in our area, in our office. And I was like, this is what, you know what I mean? Like, Alyssa, you're going to go downstairs and meet the ambulance so that they can come up immediately and hold the elevator. Let's call on. Tracy, go get the paddles. Christy, go do this. Lisa, I want you to clear the room out so we don't have any other patients in this space. And I was very methodical and totally fine. The person got wheeled away. And as soon as the crisis was over, I vomited, like right then. As my stomach just immediately reacted. And then I had the shakes and I had this kind of meltdown. But in the moment, I was fine. So that is another thing that you might see, where you might see the character handle something really well, but then fall apart, or potentially become upset at something else rather than that situation. So they're able to be logical in that moment, but then they snap at their kids later because that tension is still kind of hiding in there, or that unease is still hiding in there. So wanted to mention that. And I think your porridge example is awesome. I was also kind of going on, what would I do if given that prompt? Because I can think of a few things more boring to draw than porridge. So I kind of just started to do the same thing you were doing in terms of like, well, what does porridge make me think of? And then, I was like, well, I probably would have drawn some kind of winter scene because my mom made that on the winter. And like, if it was a snow day and, that was like the feelings that kind of come with that. So thinking, again, what trails your character might go down and being willing to brainstorm how those things make them see and feel. And again, we often talk about, like, there's the term trigger warning and all that kind of stuff. Is sometimes it's hard for me to realize that something might be a trigger for someone else because it's no trigger for me, right? So, what is it? What are those trigger points for your character, and where did those come from? Back to our backstory discussions, right? What is it that's maybe happened in their past that has changed that for them? So that's something to consider. Other thoughts on change and chaos for your characters? Or you, we all have our things.
This has been really helpful. Thank you. I'm sorry I'm late, but I was wondering, I've had a character who's going through war in the 6th century BCE, and so I'm really having a hard time. Like, I know there's a part of me that's so disgusted by war in a way that I can write it, but I can't fully write it. So I'm just like, I really found that whole thing about throwing up afterwards, what a great idea. And yet I'm still trying to brainstorm things that can go wrong because I really only have her POV and she's not like at the head of the battle charging in. So I'm trying to find ways to present what's going on. I've gone to a lookout so she can see. I've had her getting involved as much as possible, but I feel like I'm still missing something. And I guess it's because I just watched, Game of Thrones and oh my God, if you can go into an omniscient point of view of war, it's so much better than trying to do it from a limited first-person perspective of war. So anyway, and so I'm just, I don't know if you've written battle scenes like that or if anybody has any suggestions, but it's pretty crazy.
One thing I would tell you maybe to think about is Googling websites where veterans are talking about their experiences. Because I wonder, I would certainly think that there are also a lot of people, particularly, strangely enough, as there's been more drone warfare. Like, I'd be interested to see if there's any interviews with people talking about being, again, far from the action, but feeling a part of what's happening. And if that might be some, I'm a huge believer in self-help books as writing guides. So, looking like, are there books in the library that are about dealing with, and I'm 100% sure that there are, like, for the military person dealing with PTSD and dealing with, having seen these things, or, what resources are online at the Veterans Association for, like, coping with war. Because I'm willing to bet any of those resources have interviews with people where they're talking about, and then I saw this happen and I froze and I looked at this and this is how I reacted. And that just gives me a chance to kind of dig in. And I think too often we forget that those self-help books, they're 100% designed to show us how people get through various things, whether that's divorce or war or raising a kid with special needs or grief and loss or any, maybe there is for the book for that, but we have a chance to see how that person did it, and we can steal it for ourselves, which I'm totally fine with stealing. So that would be my recommendation, Lisa. I don't know, Alyssa, if you had anything, because you're also writing the exact same time period. I don't know if you guys know that. You're both doing some Amazons there.
So I read a couple books as research by a Lieutenant Grossman. One of them is called On Killing, and one of them is called On Combat. And it's about the psychological aspects of warfare and what it does to an individual person. He has a lot of modern information about, like, heart rates and like the chemical reactions. And of course, they wouldn't know all that back then, but it's not like it's changed. Like, the chemical reactions are all there. So it is quite helpful to understand how things happen, and also the difference between someone who's experienced and inexperienced in warfare and how they can kind of build a tolerance. And I think he also talks a little bit about the differences between men and women, because there's actually a chemical cocktail difference in basically in adrenaline and all that, the difference between men and women. So they've actually found with cops that having a team of a man and a woman together is actually better because they have a different chemical reaction and different sort of like panic times. So the woman is calmer like at different times than the man is. So I don't know. So there's some really fascinating information about like humans in war. So yeah, I would recommend those books. At least one of them is available in audiobook format. But yeah, On Killing and On Combat by a Lieutenant Grossman. He may have some YouTube videos as well. Yeah, but I don't know. Was there a particular? I wasn't quite sure what your question was. Like, are you having a hard time seeing the battle, like trying to understand the battle through one person, or how she interacts in the battle?
It's actually, she's mostly in the healing tent waiting for the battle. So I had to get her to a perspective where she could see the battle. And since she's not in there killing people until the very end, so it was just, I think it was just like, I'm so stuck. I'm just barfing words out at you and I apologize.
Is there a way that she could somehow overhear some people that are involved? Like maybe there's some runners that are nearby and she can overhear kind of what's going on, or?
Yeah, I definitely.
I also wonder,
maybe there's a general that's injured and there's runners coming into the medical tent giving him all the information.
Yeah.
Is injured, or like another healer who might be talking about what they've seen before. So she's having this sense of dread, like, again, to steal, Alyssa's earlier thing, like if you kind of know what's coming, like if someone's saying, okay, like this is what we need to be prepared for, they're going to be, doing this or that, like we need to have sticks for them to bite down on because the pain is going to be so bad, or, whatever, like put more sand on the floor so to soak up the blood that's coming. Like that also gives us a sense of dread, and the character a sense of dread, because even though they haven't seen it yet, they now know what's potentially coming down the road, which would be, I think, horrifying. So thank you for that resource, Alyssa. I'm actually not writing battle scenes, but I'm really intrigued by that, and I'm kind of wanting to steal that. So I might check those out myself.
Well, and it's some interesting information about what happens to your hearing and your vision when you're in like a panic response that could be applicable to every writer in every genre.
I'm stealing it for sure. All right. Any other questions or thoughts today? All's quiet. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. It's my first office hours in my new digs. So we'll see. I think the Wi-Fi here is sketchier than my home Wi-Fi, or maybe I don't know what it is, but I've noticed that today. So
that's something you might have to realize, like, because you've been in a house down here in Lower Lonsdale, the condos, everybody's knocking everybody out. So you'll find that there's probably 10 people using all the channels. So contact Shaw, get a boosting router that you would use that would boost it.
okay.
Yeah, you have to boost, big time boosting. And I've got my router 10 feet from my computer, because otherwise you're competing with all the other Wi-Fi in your building, and it's getting to be really aggressive. I'm at the point where I'm ready to, I don't know, put up copper shielding through my whole apartment so that I can get everybody else's, because it's very dense down here. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we see Lisa in a tinfoil hat, we will know why.
Exactly. Thanks for your help, everybody. I was looking for ideas, like anything, just grasping at straws. So thank you.
It's a team sport, writing. All right, everyone, have a wonderful day, and I will see you around. Take care.